of graduate school, they'd be called up, inducted into the U.S. Army to be sent to Vietnam to fight and kill or be killed. But that's war. So it was a very real issue for them and for their families. And many of them decided that they won't go. And they went to jail. They went to prison for anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. Or they went to Canada or Sweden or someplace like that. So it's this question of, you know, God's call to us is very frightening in some ways. Because we say, well, it'd be easy, I'll just go in. If they induct me, I'll go in, and well, then you might be killed. You might very well be killed. You'll kill other people. And with what justification? And so that caused people of your age, and as I said, their families and their girlfriends and so forth, their sisters also, to say, well, what is this war all about in Vietnam? Do we really have to be there? What are we trying to accomplish in Vietnam? 60,000 American troops dead, and probably 1 million Vietnamese dead as a result of the war. So it really brought that particular issue, and in a certain sense, all of American foreign policy home to people in a very direct way, because they knew they were going to have to face the induction order. And but I would say that that's the burden that we have as Christians, if we're Christians, or I mean, people always, whether they're Christians or not, we have to follow our conscience. And that, I think, is the voice of God, the call of God to all people, whether you're Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish or Christian or atheist. You know, some of the atheists and agnostics seem to have a sharper conscience in that regard than many of us. But we're called upon to follow what we believe is true and not to betray our own conscience. For instance, Dr. King said that the U.S., we've been on the wrong side of world revolutions. There are any number of instances that we could point to in that regard. Don't accept my opinion on anything. You know, form your own mind, form your own opinion. But I think I sort of like to ask young people to not just accept the dogmas of Fox News, MSNBC, none of that. You know, they're opinions. They're corporations too. They're big corporations, so they have their own interests for presenting their opinions. But we need to listen to different opinions, different sides of an issue, and investigate, study, do research. You know, that's what education is all about. Learning to understand the world in which we live, what they said I always say in Latin, la realidad, the reality. Now, that's not the reality as it's presented always on TV, or in the movies, or in the newspapers, and so forth. But you as students, you know, you're studying, you're taking this time in your life to do research, to investigate history, and we need to really understand the world in which we live. I think that's what it's all about. And then live accordingly and take action. I would just mention a book by Howard Zinn. He was the professor for many years at Boston University. The People's History of the United States. If you can buy it or find it in your library, just as an example of this kind of thing. Because we all study the history of the United States, but he presented the people's history of the United States from the point of view of the labor unions, the point of view of the indigenous populations here, the African-American slaves who were brought over, the point of view of the women's movement, the women's suffrage movement, the farm workers movement, all of these important parts of American history that are usually not touched upon in our textbooks, you know, but it's the people's history. That is the real history of the people, the common people of this country. It's just a fascinating book, but it's a real eye-opener and kind of stimulates us to do that kind of historical study. I just wanted to add, you know, that this theme of liberation has many dimensions to it. I think for many of us in this country, I consider myself still to be one of us in this country, you know, the hidden internal oppressors that we internalize in our minds that can really enslave us. You know, somebody else's expectations of what success for me must be. You know, it could be parents, it could be church people, it could be neighbors, it could be friends. You know, these ideas about the status that we need to achieve, material income, monetary income, prestige, you know, all of these things that make people, drive people to be slaves in a sense. You know, you think of people working just much more than they should. Of course, it's always necessary to have a job, to be able to have a decent life. That's a given. But to go beyond that and to be driven by other people's or ideas that have become my own, but they may be very false. They may not be really my ideas of how I want to live, the kind of person I want to be. So that is a liberation too. Liberation of my mind, liberation of my heart, you know, and not to have these false gods that are drilled into me by the mass media and sometimes by parents and peers, you know, that this is what you have to do. You have to be this or that in life. You know, we need to be true to ourselves. Everybody wants to have a material existence. This is a right. You need to have the basics satisfied. If you want to have a family, you need to have the basic necessities of the family taken care of. But beyond that, I think many people drive themselves to frustration and depression, and even worse, by these false ideals that have been drilled into us. And so a liberation, a kind of internal liberation is extremely important and life-giving. You know, for a true future, a true life in the future, hey, you know, you want to be living according to your own true ideals, you know, not according to what somebody else tells you have to be or you have to do. So I think there's that dimension of liberation as well as the political and social dimensions. And I think what helps in that regard is alternative sources of information. Not just to stay with the information from the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the local newspapers, or you know, but to really look for alternative sources. Look for the other side of issues. What I've been presenting here, the other side, in relation to, you know, some of the myths or some of the cliches of American policy. And I think you owe it to yourselves as students, as people investigating these things, to really get different points of view, and not just to accept anybody's point of view as if it were necessarily true. You need to, but I think we do have to see various aspects of an issue in order to be able to make up our own mind. Now, for some people, that involves travel. And that's important, travel to other parts of the world. You get a different perspective on the U.S. if you live for some period of time, and if you really get to know some people in Latin America or Africa or Asia, other parts of the world. But I think that, I remember during the work that we were all doing against the Vietnam War, very few of us had gone to Vietnam. I mean, it was not as common to go there as it is nowadays for college students to go to Latin America and spend the semester or something. Hardly anybody had gone to Vietnam. There was a A fellow who went there. He spent several years living in Vietnam. He came back and he would give slideshows, you know, showing Vietnamese people and the living conditions and how they lived and their desire for peace, you know, so that we would get to see Vietnamese as real persons. But I think in one way or another, you know, we do need to open our minds to different perspectives. And this is what Padre Ellacuria, the president of the university who was killed, was the main target of the assassinations. That's what he believed about the university that he was heading up, the Ellacuria University. Critical and creative consciousness effectively at work in the service of the community. But it's meant to serve, to put the gifts and talents of educated people at the service of the community to contribute to a better world.